Why is the US dollar the world's reserve currency? Wendover Productions made a much better video about this topic, and it's down in the doobly-doo, but since I already had the script wrote and was mid-editing, I decided I'll release this anyway. But if you like anything in this video, please check out the video by Wendover. He is such an amazing creator. What is a reserve currency? A reserve currency is a large amount of money currency held by the central banks and major financial institutions to use for international transactions. If you are an Australian using Aussie dollars to buy Filipino fruit, instead of converting the Australian dollar to a Filipino peso, it's much easier to just use US dollars. Now, every bank in the world could keep all 180 different currency denominations on hand for the off chance you would need to exchange a British pound for a Central African franc, but it's much easier to just keep a lot of US dollars on hand, hence the term reserve. That's what we mean by the world's reserve currency. The US dollar wasn't the first, and it won't be the last reserve currency. The most recent one before the dollar was the British pound, the empire on which the sun never sets. I'm going to do a very brief overview of historical events leading to the cause why the US dollar is reserve currency. Because of the devastating impact of World War I and World War II, which brought about the downfall of the previous superpowers. They slugged it out with each other and absolutely annihilated each other with, manpower industrially, but more importantly, financially. They became, broke. This historical pattern reminds me of the Roman Sassanid Wars, in which those two inflicted brutal damage upon each other for decades, which led to the rise of, the Arab superpower. For years and years, the majority of developed countries pegged their currency to gold or silver as a way to stabilize currency exchanges between, international sales. But when World War I broke out in 1914, many countries suspended their use of the gold standard to be able to pay their military expenses with the paper money they were printing, which devalued their currencies. Britain, although, held on to the gold standard to maintain its position as the world's leading reserve currency, and it found itself borrowing money for the first time during the third year of the war. Because even Britain became indebted to America, slowly the USA and the dollar creeped its way into becoming a new hotness. British pound, old and busted. US dollar, new hotness. At the end of World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement happened, and this will be on the test. This required all the countries to guarantee the convertibility of their currencies into US dollars. The reason why we call it the Bretton Woods Agreement is because it happened in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. A bunch of 44 allied countries came together, and they all agreed on a system to manage the foreign exchange that would not disadvantage any single country. That delegation decided the world's currencies were no longer be linked to gold, but would be pegged to the US dollar. And that's because they were guaranteed that the US dollar by itself was linked to gold. The United States was in a unique position to do this at the end of World War II because everyone else didn't have any large gold reserves on hand. The US had the vast majority, and so after World War II, USA and the USSR emerged as the world superpowers. If you were a country outside their sphere of influence, you would be considered a third world country. The USA and the USSR owe their success in part due to their unique geographical advantage. The USA is often regarded as an island due to its giant size and being protected by oceans on both sides. And on the other hand, the USSR, being the largest country ever administered by a single political entity, dwarfed the USA in terms of land area. Both countries benefited from their advantageous positions being outside of Central Europe during the early 1900s, because that was a rough place to be. The next pivotal event which led to the US dollar becoming the world's reserve currency would be Nixon taking us off the gold standard for the dollar in 1971. Remember, everyone signed the Bretton Woods Agreement 30 years prior, guaranteeing that everyone traded in US dollars because the US dollar is tied to gold. Well, 1971 it wasn't anymore. The reasons for Nixon's administration doing this was varied and complex, but in a very brief overview, there is not enough physical gold to equal the money that was in circulation. The value of money then became tied to what the US government declares it to be and how every other country uses it. The US government's backing, since all the other countries had a ton of US dollars on hand already, it was much simpler and easier to just continue using the US dollar as the reserve currency. US spending in a deficit, which was because of the Vietnam War and the Great Society domestic programs, caused the United States to flood the market with more paper money. With growing concerns over the stability of the dollar, the countries who used the dollar began to convert it into gold. The demand for gold across the world was such that Richard Nixon was forced to intervene and de-link the dollar from gold, which led to the floating exchange rates that exist today. Fast forwarding to 1991, the USSR collapses. It was the only real competitor to the US for having a world reserve currency, so now US #1. Very quick tangent. The USSR collapse, and it was a union of separate countries. Well, Russia left the union, and the only country that was remaining in the union for only 4 days was Kazakhstan. So for 4 days in 1991, when you said the word USSR, you just meant the country of Kazakhstan. Now, if you were a country which didn't want to use the US dollar as a reserve currency, you wanted to, let's say, buy or sell your oil using a different currency, you might get interventioned by the CIA or the US military. We want to ensure the use of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, and that's where the term petrodollar comes from, because if you are an Indian man buying Saudi Arabian oil, you are paying for it with US dollars. It's also just easier because, like I said before, all the banks and financial institutions have large amounts of it on hand to facilitate large transactions, large international transactions like that. The destructive forces of World War I and World War II reshaped the global power structure and changed the world's reserve currency. With the aftermath of those terrible wars, combined with the USA's political and diplomatic finagling, it solidified the USA's position as the leading superpower and established the US dollar as the dominant reserve currency worldwide. The reserve status is based largely on the size and the strength of the US economy in comparison to other financial markets. Despite large deficit spending that our government does and is trillions of dollars in debt, and our unbridled printing of US dollars, go J-Pal, the US Treasury securities remain the safest way to store money the world over. The trust and confidence that the world has in the ability of the United States to pay its debts keep the dollar as the most redeemable currency for facilitating world commerce.